What this innocent girl suffered at the hands of these 4 delinquents has become one of the most horrifying stories you'll ever hear of. One cold morning in 1990, the body of a young woman named Junko was found buried in a wasteland. This was a sad moment because the last time her parents heard from her was a phone call she made while she was missing. As the story goes, this teenager had run away from home and had called her parents to let them know. She told them not to worry because she was staying at a friend's house and was safe. But this was not entirely the case. Junko Furuta was born in the city of Misato, Japan. Living a normal life down to her teenage years, Junko worked hard to achieve good grades and also build a future for herself. At the age of 17, she was quite popular at school and was already working part-time in a store. Even as a popular person, she was never known to drink, party, or take illegal drugs. Compared to other popular kids, Junko was humble and also had respectable behavior. She already had her life planned out, as she even had a job lined up after graduation. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until she attracted the attention of an upcoming gang member. This young man had connections with Japan's most feared criminal organization, the Yakuza. Known to be a bully, the 18-year-old Hiroshi Miyano had joined the Yakuza after he became upset with how much money he was making working a regular job. Miyano had already been involved in a lot of petty crimes and had been expelled from a private school a year earlier because of his bad character. But this was not the end of this petty criminal desire. He wanted more, and his involvement with Japan's most notorious gang began to draw out Miyano's most violent desires. But he was not alone. His friends, Joe Ogura, Yasushi Watanabe, and Shinji Minato, were also his accomplices. These teenagers also had a history of violence and crime, but this was nothing compared to the crime they were about to commit together. It started when Miyano asked Junko out on a date because he had just broken up with his girlfriend and he needed a new partner. With her stunning features and popular personality, Miyano saw Junko as the best candidate for a relationship. But Junko never liked Miyano, and she knocked down his proposal. Knowing fully well of Miyano's connections with the Yakuza and his short temper ignoring him was something no girl would do. But Junko went with her heart and rejected him. Sadly, Miyano didn't take Junko's refusal in good faith. Judging from his behavior, Miyano felt embarrassed and also humiliated. But even if he did, that didn't give him the right to revenge. For Junko, she just declined his offer, but for Miyano, it was something more. November 25, 1988, at about 8:30 p.m. after work, Junko was already heading home, looking forward to watching the final episode of one of her favorite shows, Tonbo. During this time, Miyano and Minato were looking for innocent women to have their way with. This was a normal routine for the boys. They could easily look for the weakest target and always seemed to get away with it. For many of their victims, in fear of the Yakuza coming to look for them, they failed to report the crimes they suffered, and for Junko, it was about to get worse. As she rode home from work, the boys saw her and they crafted out a plan. First, Miyano hid from Junko while Minato was the one she interacted with. The plan unfolded like this. Minato knocked Junko off her bike. Then, Miyano emerged from his hiding spot, pretending to have seen the attack. He offered to walk her home safely. At this point, no one, not even Hunriko, would ever think that Miyano had hidden intentions. He only offered to walk her home, and that was it. But she was wrong. Just along the road, Miyano grabbed Junko and forced her into a warehouse. Miyano molested Junko that night for saying no to his advances, and just like every one of his victims, he threatened Junko with Yakuza thugs if she refused to give him what he wanted. She was violated by Miyano in the most sickening way possible, and she couldn't refuse. After he had finished, Miyano called his friends to brag about what he had done, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. That same night, Junko was assaulted again in a nearby hotel by several boys, and that was not all. The boys then devised a plan that would eventually lead to the death of Junko, but not before she was made to suffer through weeks of violent abuse. The next day, she was taken to a house that Miyano, Minato, and Watanabe used, and as the day went by, they were reported to have humiliated and violated Junko several times. The plan was to allow some of the Yakuza members to join in on the fun and also use Junko as a sex slave. By the third day, Junko's parents were already sick with worry. They decided to call the police to report her disappearance. Miyano and the other boys heard about it, and rather than releasing Junko, they devised another plan to ensure that both the police and Junko's parents call off the investigation. Junko was forced to call her parents and tell them that she had run away from home to stay with a friend. She told her parents that she was safe and also convinced them to call off the investigation. This gave the boys more time to have their way with Junko. Minato's parents got to find out about Junko. The boys got to know that Minato's parents had their doubts about Junko's safety. So, to have an excuse for Junko being around, Minato told them that Junko was his girlfriend. At first, Minato's parents were fooled by her son, but in the long run, they got to know what was really going on. However, knowing their son's violent nature and close affiliation with the Yakuza, they held their peace. It was later reported that his brother knew what was going on in their house, but also chose to remain silent. The fact that no one was calling the police gave the kidnappers more leverage to do whatever they wanted. By now, Junko has been mentally traumatized by the series of abuse, violation, and torture, but the worst was yet to come. About a week after the whole ordeal, other gang members were now involved, and as time went on, the torture became more twisted and inhumane. It got to a point where she was no longer allowed to wear clothes or even eat. It was reported that the boys would put skewers of hot food into her private parts, and during the cold nights, she was forced to sleep on the balcony outside. But despite the level of pain she felt, she kept on pushing, hoping that the end would soon come. A few days later, Junko finally dared to make her escape. She got hold of a phone in the house where she managed to call the police. But before she could file her complaint to the police, Minato entered the room and slammed the phone down. Naturally, the police were concerned about the call being cut short. They called back the number, and Minato answered this time. He was able to convince the police that the emergency call was made in error. For her disobedience, she was subjected to more torture, and they intended to make sure she couldn't run away again by burning her feet. They did this by pouring lighter fluid on her legs and lighting her up. They watched as she burned and screamed in pain. As it turned out, this was not the only time she had a chance to escape. One of the boys who had been invited to sleep with her decided to tell his brother about what was happening at Minato's house. This boy's brother called the police, but when they arrived, they didn't search the house. According to them, they believed the invitation to search the house was sufficient proof that there was nothing to hide. If they had followed through on the intel given to them, Junko would have been saved 16 days into captivity, and the 4 boys would have been arrested. These 4 teenagers saw Junko as a piece of trash. It got to a point where Junko was tied to the ceiling and was used as a human punching bag. It was around this time that Junko was unable to breathe through her nose anymore. Junko had internal bleeding, and it was so bad that it was seeping into her mouth and blocking her nose completely. She had lost control of her bowels, and her internal organs had been ruptured. Various objects had already been inserted into her body, ranging from broken bottles, iron bars, and even scissors. By day 30, Junko's body had given up. She could no longer walk. She had been treated like an object for her kidnappers, and while everyone was celebrating New Year's Day in 199, Junko was alone. Her wounds were now rotting, and the stench of spoiled meat filled Minato's house. At this point, the boys couldn't deal with Junko's weak body, so instead of using Junko, they captured a 19-year-old girl and molested her. Junko was already 40 days old when she begged her captors to end her life to release her from the pain. Instead, they forced her to play a game of mahjong. Surprisingly, she won the game, but the boys were angry about that. Their violent response eventually led to the death of Junko. It was so savage that her body was covered in pus oozing from her wounds. She died the next day, and in an attempt to avoid being discovered, they disposed of her body at a nearby landfill. They placed her body in a 55-liter drum and filled it up with concrete, hoping her body wouldn't be found. If not for a stroke of luck, Junko's body would not have been found, but they made a silly mistake. Remember the 19-year-old lady the boys molested because they were no longer interested in Junko's affected body? Turns out the police were now determined to catch those responsible for these acts, and surprisingly, they found themselves on the doorstep of Miyano and Ogura in late January 1999. Both of them were eventually arrested and went through a series of investigations in March. of the same year after police discovered women's underwear at one of the boys' addresses. Despite their shortcomings, the police focused on solving this case, and their next move helped to uncover the murder of Junko with some clever interrogation techniques. First, the detectives told Miyano that they knew he killed someone. Believing his friend Ogura had betrayed him to save his face, Miyano crumbled. He told the police what his friends had done and admitted to the murder of Junko. He also told the police where Junko's body could be found, and this took the police officers by surprise. The truth was that they had called the boys over an unrelated, unsolved murder of a woman and her child months before Junko disappeared. With the evidence laid before them, the police were determined to get justice for Junko and her family. Junko's body was discovered the very next day after the interrogation on March 30th, 1999. Her body and face were so ravished from a series of abuse that she could only be identified by her fingerprints. But that was not all. Despite her damaged uterus, she was pregnant by one of her attackers. Eventually, the police arrested Miyano, Minato, Ogura, and Yasushi for the crimes committed against Junko. Minato's brother was also arrested, but sadly, justice did not prevail in this case. Despite the amount of evidence, Miyano received a light sentence of 17 years in prison. He appealed, and the furious judge decided to extend his sentence to 20 years. As for the other three, Minato, Ogura, and Yasushi only served 8 years in prison. While their sentence may have been considered due to their age or connections, it was still not enough for the masses. Although the legal system tried to keep their identity a secret, journalists from Shukan Bunshun magazine managed to find their identities and publish them for the world to see. According to reports, only Yasushi has tried to keep his slates clean after he was released. But as for the others, they continue to roam the streets of Japan after spending some time behind bars. One day, Junko will get the justice she deserves, and all those who molested her before her death will surely face punishment.